walking out and it's hard to talk about challenges to higher education in front of this august audience, so I'm sure some of you will have some input. And I sort of broadened out my topic a little bit, so I will talk about those things. I know it's not obvious from my slides, but I have a book. So I wanted to talk first about challenges that I think are confronting both the U of I and higher ed in general, and that's educating iGen. This is the first generation of students coming into universities now who have had smartphones in their hands for their whole lives. Now, we talked previously about that first generation of students who had computers on their desks. My kids were part of that generation, but it's another leap to be dealing with kids who have had that smartphone access and the instantness of it and how it affects their communication. It affects their expectations with regard to tech support and how issues are going to be presented, how they engage, and they tend to engage much more by text and Instagram and other kinds of social media, and not as much face-to-face. I can't even tell you how many times I've been talking to a student who's having all kinds of issues, and I'm like, well, have you gone to see your advisor? Have you knocked on the door? And then, no, but I've emailed and texted them. I said, well, if you're really afraid of talking to them face-to-face, a phone call might work better. Because I know that professor, and they're a gray hair like me, and that email can just be a chain around our necks generationally, and the other kinds of communication often doesn't happen. I know I don't Instagram or tweet, and so so there's just a huge divide. For them, they just think this is logical, and they can't even conceive of a world in which you wouldn't respond to communication this way. And they don't want to be interrupted with personal contact. So they view that as undesirable and possibly officious and not appropriate to be going knocking on the door if there's not something that you need a signature or something face-to-face. And faculty and administration, vice versa, I think we are having a lot of trouble navigating this divide with students. I say we're all one platform behind. I'm still Facebooking. And I know from my students and from my kids that Facebook is passé, and none of them are on it, right? And so, but it just is an overwhelming thing for me to take on even more social media communication. Right now, Facebook is a way I keep in touch with friends from my high school and college and law school days, and also some international friends that we know. So I don't want to stop that. I'm sort of wedded to it. But taking on Instagram or tweeting or even Snapchat just seems like an overwhelming amount of technology. I just don't have my phone in my hand that often. And so I think that there's just a real divide there. I think we in higher ed, when we're teaching, we really have to acknowledge that and figure out how to bridge that gap. And I'm not convinced we're doing such a good job at it. I was at a faculty senate meeting in the last semester where we were talking about advising, and a couple of disgruntled, and there's lots of changes about advising going on at the university. Any of you who hang out there know that there's just a huge kerfluffle about it at the moment. I don't want to opine on that kerfluffle. I'm in the law school and it doesn't really impact me. But I will say, I sat in this meeting and listened to a couple of my very respected colleagues say, I just can't get students to come in and see me. I'd be willing to do more on this advising thing if they would make the effort. And I see in those kinds of comments the real generational divide. They are making an effort. They're making an effort in their own way. And if our only venue is come to my office and see me during my office hours, then we're not going to connect up. So I think that that's a major issue for all of higher ed and for how we deliver and support services to students and how we support students. For UI, I think there's an extra dimension because I think this is a generation of students where we're seeing that attracting them to a rural campus and a residential campus is difficult. I reflect on the fact that, when I went to college, nobody lived off campus. It was just, everybody lived on campus. Only a townie would live off campus, right? My kids go to college, so they went in 2008, And I had to put my foot down and say, you know, if you move off campus, you don't get any more money from us, because all the research says that if you live on campus, you do better. So that's the deal, you have to live on campus. You have to live in university housing, I said. You cannot move out of university housing unless you're gonna pay the town yourself, for everything. So they lived in reluctantly university housing all the way through undergrad. But I think even today I would have a much harder time supporting that. And fewer colleges and universities even have enough housing to support students living on campus, because that's not what they want to do. And so then you come to this rural environment here in this small city, and I think we have a lot of trouble. There's a certain segment of the student population that we can translate that message to very successfully, but whole other segments of the student population who, that's a difficult sell. And UI is experiencing that. I think one of our biggest challenges that we are having right now is declining enrollment, and the piece of our enrollment that's declining is first-year freshman students who are sitting in the chairs in our classrooms. We're doing okay on some of the other things. Graduate students, the law school's holding its own. The graduate student population is growing. Distance education is growing. Our dual enrollment is growing. But the thing that's not growing is those bread and butter freshman students at U of I. And I think part of that is part of the challenge there is to bridge that gap and to figure out how to make the setting of this university something that speaks to a brand new generation of kids. So that's one thing. If you're interested, there's a great book by Jean Twenge called Gen Y, Today's Super Connected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy, and Completely Unprepared for Adulthood. I'm not kind of as negative as her, but if you want to look at some of the research, she does a good job at synthesizing a lot of the research that's out there for kids and higher ed. You know, as a teacher in the classroom, I find I've always had a fairly libertarian approach to my class. You know, so my colleagues were all banning computers because students were surfing the web during class. And I never did any of that originally, because I thought the computer's my students' native environment. And even before we had a computer on our desk, we all had ways to not pay attention in class, to be working on something else. And we were multitasking just like they were. I didn't see the difference. But I have succumbed to that pressure for control in my final years of teaching and banned computers, mainly because of the research I've read about how students process information differently when they write things by hand versus when they type them on the computer screen. And so I want to make them write notes by hand and not allow them to type on the computer screen, because the amount of research out there showing that the brain activity and the way you interact with the information is profoundly different when you write by hand than when you type.
Do you explain to them that's why you
Yes, I do, and I have a link on my course pages to most recent summaries of that research. I haven't gotten too much resentment, and they are a little bit angry at the beginning, but frankly, my other colleagues banned computers a long time ago. I was sort of a, you know, so they are used to not having computers in class. I'm not paving the way on banning them. So, but, you know, it was me just having to sit there and say, wait, things are different, and my sort of libertarian approach to you figure out how to navigate it wasn't really going to work for these students. They weren't making good decisions about how to manage that tech and learning interface. I found Twenge's book to be extremely helpful, although I just will warn you, as the title suggests, a little bit more negative than I would be. I don't think that growth in technology is the author of all ills in higher ed, and I don't think that these kids are less well prepared. I just think that they are differently prepared, and we need to figure out how to communicate with that instead of trying to make them be prepared the way we were. And so I think that's a huge, huge challenge that we need to embrace. Financial pressures at the university. So first of all, you know, the funding for higher ed has changed, especially for public schools. These are general numbers. Idaho's funding for higher ed has been increasing, but has not returned to pre-08 levels. We are still about 18% or so below the level of a percentage of the state budget that was spent on higher ed at 2008 when the crash happened and where we are now. So we have not gained that. I think in some ways we've done better than a lot of states. Our state is supporting our institutions of higher education at a higher level. In some states, there's virtually no general budget appropriation for state universities. They are pretty much on their own. There are other connections that still make them be at least nominally public institutions, and that's been true for some time. Here in Idaho, we still rely to some fairly significant extent on even general appropriations for our state university budget. Yeah.
What are some of those states? I had never heard of them.
Virginia is a state, for example. University of Virginia receives no direct general appropriation. Now, they receive some specialized appropriations, but here in Idaho, we just have a general appropriation for education that they hand over to us and we figure out how to use. And that's what I mean. So I think a lot of those states, Virginia's the one that comes to my mind, and it's been that way for the longest, they're still appropriating funding for higher ed, but they're appropriating funding for this particular purpose in higher ed, or for this particular purpose in higher ed. So it's coming with strings attached. It's not just a general appropriation from the general funds of the state coming to the institution to spend, obviously, under its public board advisory structure in the way that the institution determines best. I suspect we in Idaho are in the top half of states. I don't know exactly where we are, but in the top half of the states on the percentage of our higher ed budget that comes from a general unencumbered state appropriation. But that means that the crash and the change since '08 has hit us much harder than in other states. Other states that had already weaned themselves off of such general appropriations have been able to respond more quickly as markets have recovered. U of I has not. As the state's level of funding has not returned to the pre-08 levels, we are continue to experience that shortfall in different ways, and are looking for ways to fill that gap. So I think that that's a pretty big challenge. I think it's a challenge for public higher ed in general, and for the University of Idaho in particular. I'll talk in a minute when I talk about a couple of other financial challenges, how I think they all add up, and things that happen at the university because of that.